gut is absolutely a reservoir for infection. We often saw the isolate of the bacteria from their bladder was identical to the strain that was in their
hmm
gut.
Dr. Henry Schreiber is an instructor at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. He studies how the bacteria in your gut can influence urinary tract infections, with a focus on understanding how we can address UTIs as a whole body problem instead of just a passing infection. Henry trained with Dr. Scott Holtgren, a leader in the field of UTI research, as well as Dr. Sarkis Mazmanian, an expert in the gut microbiome. With this training, Henry continues to explore the gut-bladder axis with the goal of developing new therapeutic strategies to prevent UTIs. Thank you so much for joining me to answer our long list of questions.
Oh, hey, well, thank you so much, Melissa, for having me. It's just wonderful to be able to talk with folks about this. Sometimes you get caught in your
Mhm.
tower, your ivory tower, and you don't get a chance to really talk with people much. And so I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about these really important topics.
I think this is a topic that's of particular interest to the patient community because we did get a lot
Hmm.
of questions on the gut brain axis and the gut bladder
Hmm.
axis. And I would love
Sure,
it first if you can share a bit more about your background and your area of research.
sure, that absolutely. Um, so. The questions that drive my research and or have been developed over my training are really trying to understand the complex relationships that we have with bacteria. So often we have these negative associations with bacteria, especially with people who have recurrent urinary tract infections. People that struggle with these diseases have just this negative association with bacteria. So often we have these important interactions with bacteria that are extremely beneficial to our bodies and our health. And so my research is really trying to understand that dichotomy, like why do some interactions result in beneficial outcomes and why do some result in these toxic negative outcomes? And so trying to navigate that path so that maybe we can push our interactions with our bacterial partners back into a healthy direction.
It's all very interesting, as I mentioned, and we got a lot of
Yeah,
questions. So I think it's good if we start from a term that people have heard a lot. So that's the gut-brain axis. Can you explain
sure.
what that is?
Absolutely. So the gut-brain axis is a short phrase that describes a really multifaceted, multi-layered type of connection that occurs between our gut and the brain. So the gut microbiome is the collection of organisms that inhabit your gut, that are responsible for a huge impact on our health. They are involved in metabolism of the food that we eat. They drive immune education. And those are two of and then they can also, and through those effects, they influence our immune system responses, as well as the types of molecules that we're actually being exposed to. It is, people often refer to it as this microbial organ. So what that means is that it has a purpose in our bodies in really driving our health through these metabolic and immunological factors. And so that's the gut microbiome. So when we're talking about the gut-brain axis, we're really talking about the gut microbiome to the brain
Mhm.
interaction. Uh, and that can occur in a variety of different connective pathways. One is this immunological response. So the gut bacteria help drive the maturation of your immune system. And as you might expect, the immune system responds not only to invading microbes and pathogens, but it's also responsible for keeping your body healthy and limiting inflammation. And when there is inflammation, making sure that that inflammation goes away. And so anytime that your gut microbiome is influencing your immune system, it's also influencing all of the rest of your body that's affected by your immune system. And then the other part of this that I want to highlight, there's two more parts. The other part that I want to highlight that's really important is this metabolic effects of the gut microbiome. Uh, a huge proportion of the diet that we eat, the things that we ingest, drugs, things like that, are metabolized by the gut microbiome and then are made available based on that
Hmm.
metabolism. And so the things that get to your brains, the molecule that gets to your brains first pass through the gut microbiome. And so that's another area of connection between the gut microbiome and the brain is through this metabolic space. So we have immunology, we have metabolism, and then the last bit is this neuronal connection, especially through this vagus nerve that connects the brain directly to the gut. So the gut-brain axis involves a lot of neuronal communication that can happen through the vagus nerve that reaches the brain. So you can have things that affect direct neuronal activity that could affect the brain. But when people really talk about the influence of the gut microbiome on neuronal communication, a lot of the research is focused on your enteric nervous system. Your enteric nervous system is literally the nervous system that exists in your guts. It's responsible for regulating hunger. It's responsible for regulating gut motility,
Hmm.
and it's also involved as a partner in communication with the immune system. And so it's each part of this, I presented it as three distinct pathways. It's it's much more connected. It's much less like tree trunks and much more like a shrub where things are getting connected in between them. So it's not an individual pipelines that are going through. There's a lot of crosstalk that happens between those. So the gut-brain connection is all of those connections leading into these outputs on human health.
So it's so connected. And some of the questions that we got are the gut microbiota
Mhm.
involved in all bodily sensations like hunger or mood changes? Or do those happen in the absence of bacteria as well?
That's a great question. They can happen in the absence of bacteria, but we know that the gut microbiome, through those channels that I was talking about, do influence the development of the nervous system. There's a tool that we use in research where we actually take mice and we remove all of their microbes. We're able to take the mice and before they're born into dirty cages, we're able to actually rear them in sterile cages. And we're able to keep them so that they don't have any microbes on them at all. This is obviously not possible with humans, but with mice, we're able to do it also with flies
Mhm.
and some other model organisms. Um, the important bit of this, the reason why this tool is so cool, is it allows you to determine what is being driven by the microbes themselves when you compare it to mice that are reared in dirty environments where they have all of those microbes. So this tool, it's called germ-free mice. These germ-free mice have behavioral differences compared to mice that have bacteria. They have differences in their infection susceptibility. They have differences in their immune system. There's just around the entire body, just about every organ system, or actually every organ system that I know of, has an effect from the changes in the gut microbiome because the you get born, you get exposed to this, and evolution loves to take shortcuts. It's a great shortcut to be born into a bacteria-filled world and then use that as a signal to start different developmental processes. And so that's really the driving factor behind this is the exposure to microbes not only in adulthood and through adolescence changes what you're being exposed to, but at birth, it's a this very powerful signal that lets the body know that it's time to start certain developmental cascades.
It's fascinating to think about that. And you mentioned the infection states of the germ-free mice more
Hmm.
susceptible to infection, and also that the gut microbiome contributes to the maturation of the immune system. But can you talk a little a bit more about how that happens in humans?
Sure, absolutely. So that I should say, whether or not an animal is germ-free has an impact on whether or not something will be more susceptible or not. But there are instances where a germ-free mouse is less susceptible to infection, which is really striking. It's
Hmm.
really interesting because you these mice are generally considered immunocompromised.
Hmm.
Their immune system is is a fraction of what a standard immune system is. And so to get to that point, um, part of the education of your immune system has to deal with the interactions between external sources of information and your immune system in order to tell the immune system that it needs to produce certain types of cells.
Hmm.
So you could imagine a scenario where you're giving a germ-free mouse exposure to only stimuli that produce negative results. You could be giving a mouse um, just those interactions that I was talking about at the beginning, these complex interactions with bacteria that sometimes that lead to healthy outcomes. If you remove those bacteria and give the mouse bacteria that drive it towards a negative outcome, then the mouse is more sick. You make a mouse that's more sick, that's immune system is primed for over-inflammatory reactions, to be more reactive than it should be.
Hmm.
But if you take those mice and give them bacteria that drive it towards healthy interactions, then their immune system develops more normally. They don't have overexuberant inflammation. And so, to drive that point home, if you take a mouse that is genetically susceptible to inflammatory bowel disease, so Crohn's disease and
Hmm.
ulcerative colitis, if you take those mice that are prone to this and remove all of their bacteria, some of these mouse models do not get any inflammatory disease at all. Their colons are just fine. If you give them a microbiome from a human patient that has IBD, suddenly those mice get really robust inflammatory disease. If you give those same mice a microbiome from a healthy person, they might still get disease, but it's much milder. And so there really is something about the interaction that's happening between the bacteria. And there's a lot of research into understanding the mechanisms that are undergoing that. But it does appear to be direct interactions between microbial metabolites, as well as I mentioned, the neuronal signaling plays a role in this as well. It's all, of course, all interconnected. Um, so it's really a combination of the metabolites, the bacteria being there in the first place,
Hmm.
lots of things along those lines.
It's much more complicated than the way we talk about the gut microbiome in general, which is more
Yeah,
about good versus bad organisms. And then we have conversations
yeah.
about things like biofilms, which are generally considered as a negative thing, but are
Hmm.
they naturally just part of the gut microbiome anyway?
That's a cool question. I saw that question and it made me think for a little while. So I did a
Hmm.
little bit of reading on it, and so um, the and I'm sorry to be a broken record. So it's complex.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of yes and a little bit of no. The biofilms are important in the gut microbiome because bacteria, when they attach somewhere, they like to stay attached. And so of course, they make these biofilms, which are this extracellular matrix, this slime that the bacteria produce that helps them stay put and also protects them from their environment. You could imagine a dried up slug doesn't do as well as a slimy slug, right? So the bacteria like to be slimy. That being said, the gut microbiome can be very patchy. So
Hmm.
when we think of biofilms, you tend to think of like a large sludge mat. That apparently is not the case for most bacteria.
Hmm.
Most bacteria tend to exist in kind of microcolonies. So instead of a large colony of, tens of thousands of bacteria, they're in much smaller populations that exist within the gut. And that those interactions happen. They're still in biofilm-like communities, but not the type of biofilms that you would see on catheters, for instance, urinary catheters. If you pull out a urinary
Hmm.
catheter, it's just covered in gunk. It's not that kind of a biofilm. It's much
Hmm.
more of a microcolonies type of situation instead.
Does that also mean in the bladder that could be the case? These microcolonies exist in a natural and healthy state, and that not all biofilms are bad necessarily?
That's an interesting question. Um, The existence of the bladder microbiome. I fully believe that the bladder is not sterile, which is a paradigm shift in how we think about
Hmm.
the bladder. Um, the existence of biofilm communities in the bladder is not something that I've seen evidence for, or the existence of these microcolonies. And I think that has a lot to do with the research in the bladder being generally understudied relative to the gut.
Hmm.
But then the other aspect of it being the difficulty in identifying these microbes because so many of them are not ones that are commonly studied. And so that's the tools that we would use in order to visualize them, actually literally look at them in the bladder. They're just not as many as there are for the gut, where
Hmm.
the research has been is more mature. Um, I'm not going to say that they wouldn't exist. I'm afraid I just don't know. I've not seen evidence for it one way or the other.
That's fair enough. You mentioned inflammation with the chronic
Hmm.
inflammatory bowel disease and other
Yeah.
inflammation. That I think is a common occurrence in bladder infection. A lot of people,
Oh yeah.
that's also, you spoke about the spectrum of some of these mice reacting more than
Hmm.
others because of their state. And we see that in the patient community that some people report feelings of inflammation or this inflammation that lasts for a long time. Can you talk about how that might happen in the bladder? And there's been some research recently about nerve growth factor and how this might cause prolonged inflammation in the bladder.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So we know that urinary tract infections are really driven by this inflammatory response. And again, I'm not talking about pyelonephritis or kidney infection. I'm not talking about bloodstream infections, but it's the cystitis, the bladder
Hmm.
infection itself. In research that's been done both in the clinical realm as well as in preclinical models, we have seen that inflammation is a key driver of UTI outcome and also the severity of symptoms. Um, what's interesting about that is that again, there's a spectrum of inflammatory response, and then there's a spectrum of responses to a particular amount of inflammation. There's studies that show that patients that don't have really robust inflammatory response, like so there are markers that you could look at in the urine to examine the amount of immune signaling that's occurring in the bladder
Hmm.
and that will drive inflammation. And two patients that have similar levels of that immune signaling may have wildly different symptomatology. And so it's not a one-to-one correlation, which has made some of the predictive power of this not so great, not so accurate. Um, so then what is driving that? And what the question that you asked about this nerve growth factor, what's really interesting about that is out of the Abraham lab, is it looking at nerve growth factor.
Hmm.
And what they found was that the expression of nerve growth factor from the immune system can have a long-lasting effect on the neuronal signaling within the bladder. So that the neuronal signaling itself is kind of primed to continue to respond to stimuli. So what you would expect is that under normal circumstances, the threshold to provoke a symptom response associated with pain or urgency might be here.
Hmm.
But after a urinary tract infection, after this change in neuronal signaling, after this increased expression of nerve growth factor, for instance, that threshold drops. And so as a result, the person becomes more susceptible to increased stimuli that would normally not provoke a response. So then it's somebody who's unlucky enough to be constantly getting UTIs will definitely know what it feels like, but
Hmm.
the threshold will be lower. And so what's interesting about that is that if the threshold's lower, it doesn't mean that the symptoms are lower. It means that the actual light switch to occur
Hmm.
happens more robustly.
Is this a flaw in our immune system then, or is there some kind of benefit to having these prolonged symptoms and
Ooh,
inflammation?
that's an interesting thing to consider. That's a really interesting thing to consider. Is it a flaw in our immune system?
Or is there a
I would
benefit? Is it
say,
like a fight or flight thing
oh
where
yeah,
our body is just alerting us this is happening again? But then does it get worse every time you have a UTI?
that's a great question. It's a I can I'll walk you through my thinking without
Hmm.
giving you a conclusion.
Hmm.
My thinking on that is that there is a benefit in lots of circumstances
Hmm.
for your body to be more wary of an infection if it has recently been infected.
Hmm.
For instance, right, if you had a diarrheal disease and your body is able to really quash that disease by a strong immune response, then there is a significant benefit to having that threshold be lower. So as a result, your immune system is activated more quickly.
Hmm.
Um, that is roughly analogous to adaptive immunity, where after once your body recognizes a pathogen, the threshold to start the very strong immune reaction is dropped.
Hmm.
That's beneficial. But what we're finding with UTIs is that often the paradigm of a strong immune response being really protective is not always the case.
Hmm.
There's times when patients have these really strong immune responses and it doesn't clear the infection. It doesn't help them. And so in those cases, having an even stronger immune response might not be beneficial at all. And so is it a flaw in the immune system? I don't know if it's a flaw so much as it'd probably be a trade-off where the immune
Hmm.
system is willing to accept that some people get UTIs and it sucks for them. But in these other instances, the evolutionary pressure to have a robust and quick immune response outweighs that negative. So that would probably be where I'd lie. But that's an interesting, it's a really cool question.
Because we have so many patient experiences that we hear from the community
Mhm.
where people just have these symptoms every single day and it's so debilitating. And it's not
Yeah.
helpful to be
No.
constantly told by your brain or by your gut or anything that your bladder is in danger. There's
Yeah.
nothing you can do about it, but you still have to go through this inflammatory response and the symptoms.
It's brutal. It's absolutely brutal. And the people that have to deal with this every day, you mentioned debilitating.
Hmm.
It is crushing. It's absolutely crushing uh to have this response. And it is a whole body problem. One of the things that we've talked to that happens with this is the when you get sick, your behavior changes.
Hmm.
Everything becomes worse. The when you feel bad, everything is worse. And that is an adaptive response to give your body time to heal. It's your body making you feel bad so that you don't do as much. You know, so that you are incentivized to rest and recuperate. Where it breaks down is with these chronic
Hmm.
infections, where these chronic inflammatory diseases, where you feel bad all the time
Hmm.
and you can't rest your way through it, right? It's like that's when it becomes really debilitating. That's a problem with these chronic infections.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us to the next question, which is about the neurological symptoms associated with
Hmm.
UTI. We get a lot of people reporting those types of symptoms. Is it
Hmm.
possible the bladder is directly connected to the brain, or is it via the gut that you think those mood changes or abnormal skin sensations or hot and colds? There's so many
Yeah.
different things that come up with UTI that aren't really documented in the standard lists of symptoms, but we hear them every single day from the community.
Oh, absolutely. My mom gets UTIs all the time. She's actually on an antimicrobial treatment and
Hmm.
still gets UTIs frequently.
Hmm.
Um, and we've gotten to the point where she has atypical symptoms. She does not have pain, urgency, issues with that. What she has are neurological
Hmm.
symptoms. Talking to her on the phone, I can tell when she has a UTI, because her choice of words gets a little fuzzy, or her memory gets a little fuzzy. It's harder for her to continue with a conversation. She just got
Hmm.
some brain fog. Um, and that symptomatology has been documented epidemiologically, that enough of that exists that people will be able to pick it up. This is especially prevalent when people who might have Parkinson's disease or
Hmm.
Alzheimer's, some sort of dementia, um, when they have a sudden worsening of their symptoms and they go to the ER. One of the first things that they'll first check if the person is coughing to look for a respiratory infection. The next thing that they'll do is order a urinalysis, because that connection between UTI and neurological impairment is really is really apparent in these neurologically sensitive, vulnerable populations.
Hmm.
And then, of course, as you mentioned, that happens a lot in people that are not neurologically developed. They have the brain fog. They have, something that isn't as drastic. To answer your specific question, my intuition, and this is something that this is a focus of research that's ongoing, is the connection between the bladder and the brain. There is connection between the bladder and the brain. There is through your spinal cord, there is a connection that for your brain to be able to control your bladder and your bladder to send signals to your brain, which is of course the reason why when you feel like you need to go,
Hmm.
you can wait to go. You can make a choice to wait to go to the bathroom, right? You don't just go like you have the choice of when you go. Um, but what's interesting about this is that it's not really well understood. There's not been a lot of mechanistic interrogation of this connection.
Hmm.
What are the molecular mechanisms? What parts of our bodies, what cell types are responsible for this connection is not understood well. Um, there's been some research that indicates that the connection between the gut and the brain can happen through these immunological factors as well as through these metabolic factors. My guess is that we're going to see something similar in the bladder,
Hmm.
where it's going to be driven between these immunological factors, metabolic factors, um, and the easiest place to start looking is probably in these immunological areas. But that's whether or not that will tell the whole story, I'm not sure, because this is just a wide open area. But to the people who do feel these symptoms, these neurological symptoms, changes in your behavior, changes in your
Hmm.
cognition, that's real things. Those are that you're not making them up. You're not, it's a real effect. You just don't understand it well yet.
I think patients can tell you that it's a real effect as well. But one of the
Yeah,
problems in this space is that
absolutely.
they're often told it's all in their mind. I don't know that that really means it's not real either. But
That's a
there's a
good point.
strong association between UTI and anxiety or depression. And then we have
Hmm.
these mood changes. People often say the first symptom of a UTI is this subtle shift in their mood, and they can tell it's about to
Yeah.
happen. And so I think it's a really
Yeah.
important area of research that could help patient outcomes in the future.
Absolutely. So we have this term called sickness behavior, right? Sickness behavior, if you give a mouse an injection and you give them a microbial metabolite called lipopolysaccharide, which is the outer covering of certain types of bacteria, and that outer covering is recognized by the immune system and starts an inflammatory reaction.
Hmm.
You can make a mouse uh, have anxiety-like symptoms. You can make a mouse not want to move very much. You can make a
Hmm.
mouse uh, either aggressive or extremely submissive, by giving them just, you don't have to give them the bacteria. You
Hmm.
just have to give them this outer covering. So to put a fine point on that, you can give a mammal a microbial product and change their thinking. And so like the it's it not we're not talking about like this huge decision making, but we're talking about subtle effects. You're
Hmm.
talking about making the mice grumpy and
Hmm.
tired and
Hmm.
feel bad, right? And so that's important. Those are important features of thinking. And so trying to understand that, I think, is extremely important. Um, as you said, patients know this very well. Clinicians don't have much to say. They don't have much that they can do. It's really up to us as researchers to try and figure out why this happens and then make it better, try and figure out how to make it better, right? Like that's the path forward. There's of course patients can take things into their own hands. Uh, Patients are always proactive. They're always looking for ways to get better, and those have beneficial impacts. And then researchers can hopefully we can make it better by doing the research to understand why that occurs.
That would be very helpful, definitely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree. Yeah, I think let's. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for this area of research. I think that there's ways to get at these questions. They're complex questions.
Hmm.
Um, this is a tangent,
Hmm.
give me a little grace here, but the one of the complexities of treating UTIs is that there are so often people that have bacteria in their bladders without any symptoms, and so
Hmm.
often people have symptoms without bacteria in their bladder. Clinicians have to rely, because it's predictive, on patient-reported symptoms, right? And to do this. And so that means that what's happening in your bladder has to travel all the way from your bladder, all the way to certain parts of your brain where that information is decoded and then sent to different parts of your brain where that information is recoded into
Hmm.
language that you then tell the doctor.
Hmm.
That's a lot of steps to get
It
to
is.
get at this to get at this. So treating UTIs is oftentimes so personal and subjective that that understanding this research, I think, will help us better not only develop therapeutics but maybe diagnostics too, so we can actually see how a person is responding to an infection.
Yeah, that would be ideal. I think that would help patient outcomes a lot. In the meantime, there's a lot of talk about what we can change ourselves. You've
Hmm.
mentioned patients taking things into their own hands. So let's talk a bit more about the gut microbiome and how it
Sure.
relates to urinary tract infection. Is it possible that the gut is a reservoir for UTI causing bacteria or Candida, and this keeps on seeding into the urinary tract?
Great question. The answer is absolutely. The answer is I'm happy to be definitive for this one. The gut is absolutely a reservoir for infection. We published a great paper in 2022, just a few years ago, and looking at the connection between the gut microbiome and the bladder. And one of the things that we did was to track people that have recurrent urinary tract infections before they got a UTI, and then at a time of UTI and afterwards.
Hmm.
And what we found that was truly striking for us was that we often saw that the bacteria that was causing the urinary tract infection, or the isolate of the bacteria from their bladder, was identical to the strain that was in their
Hmm.
gut. So that shows a connection. But then when you look back in time, you can see that the patient oftentimes has that bacteria in their gut before the onset of a UTI.
Hmm.
And so that indicates some level of directionality. It's not perfect, but it does suggest that there's a level of directionality between the gut and the bladder. And this what and so then I'll take that a step further. After the time of UTI, the patient goes to their doctor, they get antibiotics, their UTI is cleared. Looking back in the patient's urine, there's no sign of that specific isolate. It's gone.
Hmm.
But then we look back in the gut, and that bacteria is still hanging around. That's that exact same bug. So to put a point on this, what's happening is that the antibiotics are clearing the bladder of the bacteria, but they're not clearing the gut.
Hmm.
So as a result, you have this reservoir that persists through infection, and the bacteria is able to survive within the gut, and it can seed future infections. Um, about, as this audience is well aware, somewhere between a quarter and a third of urinary tract infections are followed up by a recurrence.
Hmm.
And about 50% of those recurrences are caused by the exact same strain that caused the first UTI. And
Hmm.
so we think that the gut, in addition to the bladder and probably the vagina and the periurethral area, those types of areas, are associated with this reservoir that enables the same strain to persist and cause multiple recurrences. Um, Now, here's the caveat. We have shown this in a way that I think is a reasonable person would accept for E. coli. We don't have the level of information on things like Candida,
Hmm.
Klebsiella, Proteus, some of these other pathogens. We don't have the data on that yet. I would be surprised if that were not the case for most of them, that there are these extra bladder reservoirs. Whether or not it's the gut or on other places, I'm not sure. But I would be very surprised if if it didn't turn out to be the case that there was extra bladder reservoirs for all of these pathogens.
In general, does the gut microbiome of someone with recurrent UTI look different to that of someone who doesn't experience recurrent UTI?
Yeah, in that 2022 paper, we asked that question.
Hmm.
We asked that question about whether or not somebody who has these recurrences, if their gut community, what does the composition look like?
Hmm.
Like who is in your neighborhood? Like it's really a demographic analysis. Like who's in your gut neighborhood? And it turns out that they are distinct.
Okay.
Um, we found that people who have recurrent urinary tract infections have less diverse bacteria, and they oftentimes have a lower numbers of the types of bacteria that we generally consider to be beneficial. So
Hmm.
these are things that these are bacteria that make metabolites that are associated with immune health, liver health, gut health, these types of things are called they make things called short chain fatty acids or
Hmm.
SCFAs. And in our study, we found that one particular type of short chain fatty acid producing bacteria that make butyrate, which is a four carbon chain. This butyrate producers are oftentimes are reduced in people with recurrent urinary tract, women with recurrent urinary tract infection
Hmm.
relative to demographic controls. So not only are they less diverse, but they also have less of these butyrate producers. What's interesting about the diversity about the reason why I'm focusing a little bit on diversity, um, is because it's in general a more diverse community indicates that your gut is healthier. A
Hmm.
less diverse community would be one that doesn't have jobs and that all the bacteria can fill. So like there's you don't have maybe you're not getting all the types of metabolites that you want, or your immune system is getting an overabundance of certain types of signals rather than healthy signals. So diversity is generally considered to be beneficial in the gut microbiome. Um, yeah, so that there's some interesting connections. There's some interesting connections there. We're really working now that we've found this in people.
Hmm.
We want to understand what are the mechanisms, what's the actual output of that. And so that's ongoing research. We're trying to figure out some of the molecular mechanisms that are associated with this observation. Does it have an impact on UTI outcome and
Hmm.
overall bladder health? This is something that we're currently working on.
The obvious question from there is if we know diversity is important, has research shown
Mhm.
that we can reestablish a healthy microbiome?
That's that is literally $1 billion question. Like like there are like billions of dollars industry trying to understand this. Um, and to be blunt, in my personal opinion, not the opinion of my institute or any of my
Hmm.
collaborators, I have found that the efforts to repair the gut microbiome have been mixed. There's certainly instances when it's extremely beneficial for somebody to get the microbiome back. Um, but the connection between the gut microbiome and the gut is more complex than just one side or the other. It's really the interaction between them.
Hmm.
And if you uh, probiotics have been shown to be effective in a lot of areas. They have been shown to be really effective if they're constantly taken.
Hmm.
But where they haven't been shown to be particularly effective is giving a patient a dose of probiotics and then letting them get off the probiotics. Oftentimes, the gut environment is in such a way that they end up moving back in towards the away from the gut microbiome space that they wanted to be in and towards a more unhealthy version of their
Hmm.
gut microbiome. And so that disconnect between the fact that probiotics have a beneficial effect and they don't appear to be permanent effects I think is an area of interest to a lot of people, and trying to understand that is beneficial. Um, in terms of RUTI, in terms of recurrent urinary tract infections, I would love it if we could give somebody a dose of probiotics or a month of probiotics and then they're
Hmm.
cured. Uh, I would say that we are moving towards understanding the system in such a way that we can make that we can achieve the goal of a healthy gut. I don't know if dropping in a whole community of microbes will be the way that we do it, but it's certainly
Hmm.
something that's being explored.
How's fecal matter transfer been looked at in this respect?
Actually, there has been, which is wild. There was one paper with a very small cohort that looked at people who have this recalcitrant uh, RUTI. These people that get
Hmm.
RUTI, no matter what you try and do with them, what happens? And there's another study where they people got a fecal microbiota transplant. Um, for other reasons. And then they looked at UTI outcome after
Hmm.
the fact. And in both of those cases, it does appear that that their UTIs were lessened in both of those papers, which is great news. That's wonderful. Um, it's unclear why. It's unclear if the change in the gut microbiome changed the immune response, or
Hmm.
if it did remove that reservoir or made the reservoir much smaller, or reservoir space much smaller. That's unclear. Um, I can say it's certainly not something that will show up next month. I'd be surprised if it were to show up next month, but it's something that I think is possible, especially for people who are potentially people who are hospitalized and their
Hmm.
gut microbiomes have been demolished by antibiotics, something like that,
Hmm.
where their gut microbiomes have just been decimated. Going back and adding back a healthy microbiome could very well be extremely beneficial for them. We just don't have the research to support that at this time. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that it's not a biological reality. Just don't have the data on it yet.
Yet more research that needs to be done.
Oh yeah. Yeah, give us money.
Yeah, I know that's the problem. So, what are you working on right now?
Oh, good questions. So I have a few projects, and I'll talk about a couple that I'm really excited about. One is following up on this analysis of the gut microbiome influence on UTI
Hmm.
severity. So we have this connection in a clinical setting, and as I mentioned, we really want to understand the molecular mechanisms. You might ask, well, why? Why do we care? If we could just do a fecal microbiota transplant, why? Um, if we can understand the mechanisms, then maybe we can make targeted therapies. We can make
Hmm.
things that are really specific that achieve the results that you want without any off-target effects. You're not replace if you don't have to replace a person's entire gut microbiome, if you can give them something that's more targeted that just flips the switch that needs to be flipped in order for them to achieve a healthy state. That's better because it has a
Hmm.
less chance of off-target effects. So the research that I'm doing right now has moved into a mouse model. We're trying to develop more targeted approaches that will influence UTI outcome and understand the connections between the gut microbiome and the bladder. And that involves investigations of the immune system, as well as these gut metabolites, and using the tools that have been made available through research in the Holcomb lab, these
Hmm.
very powerful mouse models. It's a really wonderful model of infection. That really recapitulates a lot of this human disease. So that's been an extremely valuable tool in order to understand UTI outcomes
Hmm.
using these mouse models. And
Is
then
anything that
that
I just wanted to ask about the targeted therapeutics that you're working on.
yeah,
Is there anything that will be aiming for a clinical trial in humans in the future?
that is always the goal.
Hmm.
The working both with Sarkis and Scott. One of the things that drew me, a shared passion that Scott and Sarkis both have, is research to help people.
Hmm.
There's, and a driving force behind that is taking the discoveries that you have and driving towards something that's a deliverable good that can help everybody. And so that's the goal, the motivating factor. Uh, I have these questions, but the ultimate goal is to find something that can help people.
Hmm.
And so those targeted therapeutics are a long way off. I have not even gotten to the point where I would be comfortable talking about what types of targeted therapeutics I'm actually
Right.
investigating because I don't want to if I'm still at a stage where I could be wrong, right? And
Fair enough.
I don't want people to jump in something that's where it could be wrong.
Hmm.
It's too yeah. Um, but the goal is always to do, uh, and that's in Sarkis's lab. There are goals to treat the gut-brain axis. In
Hmm.
Scott's lab, um, there's really a lot of focus on understanding how bacteria can colonize. And so a lot of the research that I'm happy to say for that the Holcren lab has done, some things that are to give hope to people. There are new therapeutic options that are being tested in clinical trials
Hmm.
have show a lot of efficacy. There's things that are driving towards preventing bacteria from inhabiting the bladder where they cause disease.
Hmm.
So specifically targeted at E. coli, which are cause the vast majority of uncomplicated UTIs, really preventing them from colonizing the bladder. So there are therapeutics that are directed towards that. And then my research is focused a lot on trying to repair the connection between the bacteria and the host in such a way that UTIs don't develop also. And
Hmm.
so those could be combined and we'll see in the future. You know, let me find the big piece of wood to knock on. I'm hopeful for the research that we have. But it's not I think there is hope. There's research being done on these. It's not nearly as neglected as it used to be. It used to be that UTIs were treated as a passing infection. You get your antibiotics and you move
Hmm.
on your way. Um, and then in the last 20 years, 25 years, the complexity of UTIs has drawn a lot of interest. And so there's a lot of work being done towards fixing these things.
It's a very encouraging note to end on. It sounds like we should do a follow-up interview at some point to find out
Sure.
more about your next research.
Absolutely. I think it's really great. It never stops, man. We keep going. I'm so lucky. It's super interesting. It's super complex.
Hmm.
And I really feel I do strong. I want to we're working hard. We're trying. We know. We know that it sucks. We know how tough it is for folks. We're aware of that and we want to help. And so we're doing the best that we can for it. And I wish it moved faster because I wish it moved faster. But we have to be careful and we have to be precise. You can't just I would love to write a book that says I can cure your UTIs tomorrow. And but I don't want to be I don't think that's prudent. I don't think it's safe. And so I
Probably
think
not.
no, no, no. And so anybody, just to last point, there is a lot of stuff out there that talks about things that people can prove your UTIs. Just if it works for you, that's great. But if it doesn't work for you, that might just be because biology is weird. Don't
Yeah.
be like it's just the way it's biology is just weird. These things are so complex. So just yeah, just keep up the good fight. We'll all do the same.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to make everybody's journey is different with this, and something that works for one
Yeah.
person might not necessarily work for the next, and it's really important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much again for answering all our questions, and I look forward to chatting to you more in the future, I hope.
Oh, absolutely, Melissa. This was just an absolute blast. Thank you so much. Like this, you do such a service. So this, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this expert video helpful. If you'd like to learn more about this or related topics, be sure to check out our other videos or head over to liveUTIfree.com for related articles. We'll drop some links in the video description. If you like what we're doing on this channel, you can support our work by hitting subscribe here on YouTube, and don't forget to tick the bell so you'll be notified of our future videos. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, keep asking questions and pushing for better solutions.